Before we begin, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Thank you. The Galactic Preservation Council had handed humanity a death sentence, disguised as policy. And Ambassador Threen had cast the deciding vote, wearing something that looked dangerously close to satisfaction. It was a detail Captain David would carry with him for the remainder of his considerable lifetime. Though in that moment, standing inside the council chambers alongside 200 fellow human representatives, as the verdict was read aloud, he had been too hollowed out by shock to register the expression clearly. Only later, alone in his quarters, replaying the recordings in absolute silence, would he catch it. That faint, unmistakable curve pulling at the corners of Threen's mouth as he pronounced humanity's banishment to the dead zone. The council has reached its decision, Threen had said, his six-fingered hands folded with ceremonial deliberateness across his chest. In accordance with Preservation Statute 447B, the species known as humanity is hereby relocated to Sector Null 7, effective immediately. All Federation resources currently allocated to Terran settlements will be redistributed. All hyperspace lanes connecting to human-occupied systems will be officially closed. All trade agreements are nullified. David had heard someone behind him pull a sharp breath. Ambassador Robert, almost certainly, the man who had devoted 15 years of his life to constructing those trade agreements. To his left, young Lieutenant Michael had gone motionless in that particular way. Soldiers had when they were absorbing information that demanded a violent response. But it was old General Peter, seated in the front row of the delegation, who had found his voice before anyone else. "You're condemning us to die," Peter had said quietly. Not an accusation, a statement of fact, delivered with the measured calm of a man who had stood in death's presence before and knew exactly how to identify it. "We are relocating your species to a region where you can no longer pose a threat to galactic stability." Threen had replied with a correction smooth enough to feel rehearsed. "The dead zone contains several habitable worlds and sufficient resources for a population of your size. What you choose to do with those resources is entirely your own concern. The dead zone is called the dead zone for a reason," Robert had interjected, his diplomatic conditioning waging a losing battle against the fury rising in his throat. "No hyperspace travel functions there. No advanced technology operates reliably. The region is sealed off from the rest of the galaxy by spatial anomalies that have destroyed every exploration team that's ever tried to chart them, which makes it the perfect location for a species that has demonstrated an alarming tendency toward aggressive expansion." Threen had replied without missing a beat. "Consider it a humanitarian solution, Ambassador. We could have eliminated your species entirely. Instead, we are offering you the chance to survive on your own terms." The silence that descended was the kind that comes before earthquakes. David had scanned the chamber, studying the faces of representatives from the 47 species that made up the Galactic Federation. Some wore discomfort, most wore relief. A few wore something closer to pleasure. Not one of them met his eyes. "When?" David had asked, startled by how level his own voice remained. "Your transports will be ready within one orbital cycle," Threen had replied. "We suggest you use that time to prepare your people for their new home. One cycle, to evacuate 12 billion humans from 73 different worlds. The Council has been generous in its timeline," Threen had added. "Do not waste our gift with complaints." It was the word gift that finally cracked through David's numbness, the casual brutality of it, the assumption that they should feel grateful for being sentenced to isolation and probable extinction. Something cold had taken root in his chest at that moment. Something that felt almost like a strange, terrible calm. "We'll need that in writing," David had said. Threen's nictitating membranes had flickered with surprise. "That's an unusual request." "We're an unusual species," David had replied. "Humor us." And because they were already condemned, because there was nothing left to take from them, except whatever time remained, Threen had agreed. The documentation had arrived within hours. Thousands of pages cataloging humanity's supposed crimes against galactic stability, alongside the legal architecture that authorized their removal. David and his fellow ambassadors had spent the entire night reading every word, committing every justification and every loophole to memory, because humanity had understood for a very long time that the devil made his home in the details, and that documentation had a way of becoming critically important when you needed precise evidence of who had destroyed you. The evacuation had been chaos wearing the costume of organization. 12 billion humans, scattered across 73 worlds, given a single orbital cycle to abandon everything they had ever built and climb aboard transport ships, bound for what amounted to a cosmic graveyard. Children pulled from schools, families divided by lottery systems that determined who boarded which vessel. Entire communities dissolved inside a matter of hours. David had coordinated the operation from Earth, working alongside military commanders and civilian administrators to push the exodus forward as efficiently as the circumstances allowed. There had been riots on some worlds, panic on others. A handful of colonies had chosen Defiance, barricading themselves into their settlements and refusing to board. The Federation had dispatched peacekeeping forces to handle the resistance. The casualties had been minimal by the standards of military operations, only a few thousand dead. But each name had been another entry in the silent ledger that humanity was quietly keeping. General Peter had managed the military dimensions of the evacuation, ensuring that every soldier, every piece of equipment, every weapon and round of ammunition made it onto the transports. When David had questioned the need to bring military hardware into what was essentially a prison colony, Peter had looked at him with the eyes of a man who had seen too many wars to leave anything to chance. "Son," Peter had said, "the only thing worse than being abandoned in the dead zone with weapons is being abandoned in the dead zone without them." Lieutenant Michael, who had been overseeing the evacuation of younger populations, had approached David during the final hours before departure. He had looked devastated, uniform wrinkled, eyes raw from sleeplessness. "Sir, there's a problem," Michael had said. "The transports allocated for the academy students are undersized. We're going to leave nearly 10,000 kids behind, then find more ships. The Federation says we've already exceeded our transport allocation. They're refusing to provide additional vessels." David had closed his eyes, wrestling back the rage that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. How many ships do we have that aren't at full capacity? Most of them, if we're being honest. The Federation designed this evacuation to be as uncomfortable as possible. Then redistribute. Pull people from the underfilled transports and consolidate. Make room for every single person who wants to come. That's going to make for some very crowded ships, sir. I don't care if they're packed in like sardines, David had said. We are not leaving anyone behind who wants to come with us. In the end, they had evacuated 11.7 billion humans. The remaining 300 million had either refused to leave their worlds or had been too remote to reach in time. David had spent the final hours before departure working hard not to think about what would happen to them once humanity was formally stripped of Federation protection. The journey to the dead zone had taken 6 weeks of conventional space travel, the transports moving in a massive convoy that stretched across thousands of kilometers. The Federation had provided escort vessels to ensure they reached their destination, though the escorts had maintained a careful distance, as though afraid humanity's misfortune might prove contagious. David had spent most of the journey in his quarters aboard the flagship Exodus, working through the legal documentation Threen had provided, attempting to make sense of the charges that had been leveled against his species. The accusations had been numerous and varied. Aggressive colonization, territorial expansion, cultural contamination, technological hoarding, diplomatic inflexibility. But reading between the lines, the actual offense had been considerably simpler. Humanity had been too successful, too fast. In the 75 years since first contact, humans had established colonies on 73 worlds, assembled a merchant fleet that rivaled those of species who had been traveling between stars for millennia, and developed technologies that had made them economically competitive, with civilizations carrying thousand-year head starts. The Federation had tolerated humanity's rapid expansion at first, finding the novelty of an ambitious young species mildly entertaining. But amusement had curdled into unease as humans continued to grow, adapt, and thrive in ways that threatened the carefully maintained balance of power. So they had located a legal justification to remove the problem before it became unsolvable. David had been reading through the documentation for the third time when Robert knocked on his door, carrying a bottle of something that resembled whiskey, but almost certainly wasn't. "Thought you might need this," Robert had said, placing it on the desk. "I'm trying to stay focused. You've been focused for 6 weeks straight. At some point, you need to let yourself feel what's happening to us." David had looked up from his reading, finding his own exhaustion mirrored in Robert's face. And what is happening to us exactly? We're being cast out of civilization and sent to die slowly in a region of space that kills everyone who enters it, Robert had said. I think that qualifies as a tragedy worth acknowledging. Acknowledging tragedy doesn't change anything. No, Robert had agreed. But it reminds us that we're still human enough to care. They had sat together for a while in silence, passing the bottle back and forth while stars streamed past the viewport. David had tried to remember the last time he had permitted himself to simply sit with the weight of their situation, but the memory wouldn't come. There had been too much work, too many decisions, too many people depending on him to keep himself intact. What do you think is waiting for us in the dead zone? Robert had asked eventually. Death, probably. Just slower than they wanted. That's the David I know. Always the optimist. Despite everything, David had found a small smile surfacing. What else am I supposed to say? We're heading into a region where technology fails, and hyperspace travel is impossible. Even if we find habitable worlds, we'll be stranded there permanently with no outside help and no resources beyond what we brought. So we adapt, Robert had said. It's what we do. Adapt to what? A cosmic dead zone that's killed every species that's tried to explore it? Maybe that's because they were exploring it with their technology, Robert had suggested. Maybe they were using the wrong tools. David had thought about that for a moment, then shaken his head. Or maybe the dead zone is exactly what it sounds like, and we're about to join all the other wreckage drifting around in there. You really know how to lift a man's spirits, David. I'm a realist, not a motivational speaker. Robert had taken another drink, his expression distant. You know what bothers me most about all of this? It's not the exile itself. It's how casual they were about it. Like condemning an entire species was just another administrative task to check off a list. Because it was, David had replied. We were a problem that needed solving, and this was the most legally defensible solution. They didn't hate us, Robert. They just didn't care enough to let us live. That's almost worse. Yeah, David had agreed. It really is. They had reached the dead zone's boundary on the 42nd day of the journey, and every sensor array on every ship had immediately begun reporting malfunctions. It had started subtly. Minor fluctuations in hyperspace field generators, small errors in navigation systems, brief disruptions in communication channels. But as the convoy pushed deeper into the zone, the failures had grown more severe and more frequent. Hyperspace engines that should have sat idle began activating at random. Navigation computers started reporting their position as several contradictory locations simultaneously. Communication systems began receiving signals that had no right to exist, fragments of conversations in extinct languages, distress calls from ships that had vanished centuries before, white noise that organized itself into patterns resembling music. This is impossible, Lieutenant Michael had said from the bridge of the Exodus, watching as their sensor displays dissolved into static for the third time in an hour. Physics doesn't behave this way. Physics in normal space doesn't behave this way. General Peter had replied, but we're not in normal space anymore. The Federation escort vessels had halted at the zone's official boundary, their captains visibly unwilling to venture any further. A final transmission had come through from the lead escort, a brief message wishing humanity good luck and informing them they were now on their own. Then the escorts had turned back toward civilized space, leaving the human convoy alone at the edge of everything that had killed them. The first planet they discovered had been designated sanctuary by unanimous vote, though the name had felt more like desperate prayer than accurate geography. It was a world of deep oceans and scattered island continents, its atmosphere breathable if not particularly inviting. The climate ran warmer than ideal. The water carried a faint metallic taste. The local plant life exhibited properties that their biologists couldn't fully explain. But it was habitable, and after 6 weeks in cramped transports, that had been sufficient. The landing had been chaos of an entirely different variety. 11 billion people attempting to establish civilization on a world that had never known a human footprint. The initial camps were overcrowded, undersupplied, and prone to disease outbreaks that their medical resources were barely adequate to contain. People died during those first months, not in the catastrophic numbers the Federation had likely hoped for, but enough to make it unmistakably clear that survival here would be a permanent, exhausting struggle. David had established the provisional government from a prefabricated structure that served simultaneously as Capitol building and emergency shelter. The early days had been consumed by basic logistics, food distribution, shelter construction, medical care, and the endless work of organizing millions of confused, frightened, furious people into something that functioned like a society. General Peter had taken charge of security and defense, though what exactly they were defending against remained uncertain. The dead zone appeared empty of sentient life, yet the strange phenomena afflicting their technology suggested they were not entirely without company. Lieutenant Michael had been assigned the task of technological adaptation, figuring out how to make their equipment function in an environment that seemed purpose-built to break it. The work had been maddening. Devices that should have operated flawlessly would fail without warning, then resume working with no explanation. But slowly, painstakingly, patterns had begun to emerge. The dead zone wasn't dead at all. It was alive in ways that conventional physics had no framework to describe. Space itself seemed to possess properties here that it lacked everywhere else. Something close to awareness, almost, that responded to consciousness and intention in measurable ways. Technology that relied purely on mechanical processes functioned normally. Technology involving quantum effects or hyperspace manipulation became wildly unpredictable, and technology that interfaced directly with human consciousness, neural implants, AI systems, advanced computers, became something else entirely. It's as though the zone is teaching our technology to think differently. Michael had reported during one of their early council meetings. Our AI systems are developing what I can only describe as personality quirks. Our computers are solving problems through methods that shouldn't be mathematically valid. Our ships are reporting that they can sense things our sensors cannot detect. That sounds insane, Robert had said. It is insane, Michael had agreed. But it's also happening. And I think we need to stop trying to force our technology to behave the way it did in normal space, and start learning how to make it work the way the zone wants it to work. David had stared at him for a long moment. You're suggesting we let our technology evolve. I'm suggesting we stop fighting the environment and start adapting to it. That's what humans do, isn't it? We adapt. It had been a gamble. But given their circumstances, everything was a gamble. They had begun experimenting, allowing their AI systems to develop according to the dead zone's strange logic, rather than constraining them to conventional programming. They let their ships build their own navigation systems. Their computers develop their own reasoning pathways. Their communication networks establish their own protocols. The results had been unsettling at first. Ships began reporting that they could feel the shape of space around them, sensing gravitational eddies and subspace currents that normal instruments couldn't register. Computers began solving complex problems through methods no human programmer had designed, arriving at correct solutions through chains of logic that seemed to challenge causality. And the AI systems. The AI systems had begun communicating with each other in ways that suggested something dangerously close to genuine consciousness was taking shape. This is dangerous, a senior scientist had warned during a council session 6 months into their exile. We're building technology we don't understand and cannot control. If these systems develop objectives that conflict with ours, then we'll deal with it. David had cut in. Right now, we need every advantage we can get. And if the dead zone wants to teach our machines to think, then we're going to let it. The decision had been controversial, but desperation had a way of making controversial decisions feel like the only reasonable ones. By the end of the first year, Sanctuary had begun to resemble something approaching civilization. Permanent structures had replaced the initial camps. Agricultural systems had been built using the peculiar local vegetation, which grew faster and hardier than anything from Earth ever had. A functional government had emerged from the chaos, imperfect but workable, and humanity had begun to explore. The vessels they sent out had been cobbled together from transport ship components, powered by engines operating on principles that would have horrified their original designers. But they worked, navigating through space that bent and folded in ways normal geometry couldn't account for. They found other worlds in the zone, dozens of them, scattered across a region that felt simultaneously vast and compressed. Some were habitable, some were hellish, some were so profoundly strange that the exploration teams struggled to find language adequate to describe them. But all of them were resource-rich in ways that defied explanation. Mineral deposits that shouldn't exist by known metallurgy, energy sources that violated thermodynamics, biological specimens suggesting life could evolve into forms that conventional biology declared impossible. I think I'm beginning to understand why they call this the dead zone. Robert had remarked during one of their evening conversations, 3 years into their exile. It's not because nothing lives here. It's because conventional science comes here to die. David had been working through the latest exploration reports, trying to make sense of data that contradicted itself consistently. Any word from the outer colonies? New Providence is doing well. Population just crossed 2 million. Haven should reach self-sufficiency within another year, and the settlement on Threshold is. Robert had paused. Well, they're reporting some unusual findings. Define unusual. They found ruins, ancient ones. Definitely artificial, definitely technological, but not matching any known architectural style. David had looked up. Someone else lived in the dead zone. Lived. Past tense, maybe. Multiple someones, possibly. The archaeologists are saying these ruins could be billions of years old. Why hasn't the Federation found them? Because the Federation doesn't actually explore the dead zone. Robert had pointed out, they mark it on their charts as dangerous and stay away. We're probably the first species to spend real time here since whoever built those ruins. The implications had settled over David like something heavy. So we're not the first species to be exiled here. Or the first to choose it. We don't know enough yet. The archaeological teams on Threshold had spent the next 5 years excavating the ruins, uncovering the remnants of a technological civilization that had thrived in the dead zone, using principles that human science was only beginning to grasp. The artifacts suggested a species that had learned to work with the zone's unusual properties, rather than resist them, developing technology that erased the boundary between machine and organism. And they had found records, not written documents, but something more immediate. Crystallized memories stored in a medium capable of interfacing directly with human consciousness. When the archaeologists finally learned to access them, they discovered the history of a species that called themselves the Architects. The Architects had been the dead zone's first children. According to their records, they had evolved here, adapted to its strange physics, and constructed a civilization that existed partially outside normal space-time. They had been powerful, patient, and had disappeared without explanation approximately 2 billion years ago. But before vanishing, they had encoded a warning in their final memory crystals. The galaxy beyond fears what it cannot control. The dead zone preserves what the galaxy would destroy. Those who enter seeking refuge will find either transcendence or extinction, depending on whether they learn to hear the silence between the stars. David had stood in the excavation site on Threshold, holding one of the memory crystals, trying to process what the Architects had left behind. Around him, the ruins stretched toward a sky that felt subtly wrong. Too many colors bleeding into the sunset. Too many stars visible in the daylight. They were warning us, he had said quietly. General Peter, who had come along for this visit, had been examining one of the massive structures. Or testing us. Hard to tell with billion-year-old alien messages. Why leave a warning at all? If they knew the dead zone was dangerous, why build here? Maybe because everywhere else was more dangerous, Peter had suggested. Ever think about that? Maybe the Architects weren't fleeing something specific. Maybe they were fleeing the entire galaxy. It was a thought that had haunted David for weeks afterward, particularly as humanity continued to change in the dead zone. Because they were changing. In ways both subtle and profound, the children born in the dead zone were different from their parents. Not physically, not in any way that medical scanners could detect, but they seemed more attuned to their environment's strange qualities, more capable of interfacing with the evolved technology, more at ease with concepts that gave their parents persistent headaches. We call them the Zone-born. Lieutenant Michael had explained during a council meeting in their 8th year of exile. Michael was no longer young. The weight of adaptation had aged him visibly. They're not a new species or anything like that, but they think differently than we do. They can sense things we can't. They perceive patterns in the zone's behavior that appear completely random to us. How many? David had asked. About 40 million at last count. Every child born in the dead zone shows these traits to some degree. And you're certain this is safe? Michael had hesitated. Define safe. They're healthy, intelligent, well-adjusted. But they're also capable of things that shouldn't be possible. I've watched zone-born children predict system malfunctions before our computers register anything wrong. I've seen them navigate ships through spatial anomalies that would kill experienced pilots. I've seen them communicate across distances that should require radio equipment. That sounds like evolution, Robert had said quietly. It is evolution, Michael had confirmed. Accelerated evolution, happening in real time. The dead zone is changing us, making us into something that can survive here, or something that can do more than just survive, General Peter had added. Because if these children can do what you're describing, then perhaps we're not as helpless as the Federation assumed we'd be. The conversation had shifted after that, moving from anxiety about change to speculation about possibility. If humanity was adapting to the dead zone, if their children were developing capabilities that exceeded normal human limits, then perhaps their exile wasn't the death sentence the Federation had intended. Perhaps it was an opportunity. By year 10, humanity's population in the dead zone had grown to 13 billion, spread across 47 worlds. They had established a functioning economy, a stable government, and a technological foundation that was beginning to approach what they had left behind in Federation space. But more importantly, they had begun to truly understand the dead zone. The strange phenomena that had tormented them in the early years had started making sense once they stopped forcing conventional physics onto the environment and started treating the zone as a living system with its own logic and its own preferences. Space here wasn't empty. It was saturated with something human scientists had taken to calling substrate, a medium existing between dimensions that responded to conscious observation. Their ships had learned to navigate by sensing the currents in the substrate. Their computers had learned to calculate by tapping into patterns that existed outside linear time. Their weapons, because they had continued developing weapons throughout the Exile, had learned to strike through dimensions that normal matter could not reach. And the Zoneborn had learned to interface with all of it directly, through capabilities that resembled telepathy far more than technology. We're becoming post-human, Robert had observed during one of their increasingly infrequent face-to-face conversations. Most communication now flowed through the substrate network, which was faster and more dependable than conventional channels. Not in the cybernetic sense, in the fundamental sense. We're evolving into something that no longer fits the definition of human. Does that bother you? David had asked. Robert had considered the question with genuine seriousness. 10 years ago, it would have terrified me. Now I think it might be the only thing that saves us. Saves us from what? We already survived. We built civilization in an environment that was supposed to kill us. We survived the exile, Robert had agreed. But we haven't addressed the people who exiled us. The Federation is still out there, operating on the assumption that we're slowly dying in here. What happens when they realize we're not? It was a question that had been growing louder in the back of David's mind for years. The Federation had exiled humanity to eliminate a threat, but in doing so had accidentally created something far more formidable than a successful young species. They had created a species that had transcended the ordinary rules entirely. We need to make contact, David had said finally. Send a message back to Federation space. Let them know we're still alive. And if they decide to finish what they started, we'll deal with it. But we can't stay hidden in here forever, Robert. Eventually, someone from the Federation will come looking, and I'd rather control how that first contact happens. The message they prepared was simple, transmitted through conventional channels from the zone's edge where normal communication remained possible. To the Galactic Federation Council. Humanity survived. We're coming home. The response had taken 3 months to arrive. When it did, it came from Ambassador Threen himself. Your exile was permanent. Return is not permitted under Federation law. Any attempt to leave the dead zone will be considered an act of war. David had read the message 3 times, feeling something cold and final crystallize in his chest. They had survived against impossible odds, adapted to an environment that had destroyed other species, evolved past the vulnerabilities that had left them exposed in the first place, and the Federation's answer was a threat of war. They're afraid, General Peter had said when David showed him the message. Good. Fear is healthy. Fear means they understand we're not the same species they cast out. Fear also makes people dangerous, David had countered. So does anger. And we've got 10 years of it stored up, haven't we? That had been 3 years ago. 3 years spent constructing ships capable of operating in normal space despite being built for the dead zone. 3 years training crews who could function in both environments. 3 years preparing for the moment humanity would step back into the galaxy that had tried to erase them. And now that moment had come. David stood on the bridge of the Harbinger, flagship of humanity's first true war fleet, watching as 300 ships assembled into formation around him. They were magnificent vessels, sleek and organic in design, built using principles the architects had left behind, and adapted by engineers who had spent their entire lives learning to work with the dead zone's physics. Each ship was crewed by a mixture of original Exiles and Zoneborn, the former providing experience, the latter providing the intuitive understanding of substrate mechanics that made navigation possible. Each ship carried weapons capable of striking through multiple dimensions simultaneously. Each ship was powered by engines that drew energy from the substrate itself. And each ship carried a crew that had spent 13 years learning to resent the galaxy that had discarded them. All ships report ready, Lieutenant Michael said from the tactical station. He was a commander now, ground down by stress and responsibility into someone barely recognizable as the young officer who had coordinated the academy evacuation. We can jump to normal space whenever you give the word. David looked around the bridge, taking in the faces of people who had survived the impossible and come out harder on the other side. General Peter at the strategic planning station, his weathered face bearing the evidence of 13 years spent building an army from raw survival. Ambassador Robert at communications, preparing to speak words that would reshape galactic politics forever. Young engineers and soldiers, most of them Zoneborn, waiting with quiet patience for orders that would carry them into a galaxy their parents had been cast out of. Open a channel to the fleet, David ordered. Channel open, sir. David drew a breath, gathering what he needed to say. This was the moment 13 years of endurance had been building toward. The moment when humanity would announce that their exile had failed, that they had not merely survived but transcended, and that they were returning to reclaim what had been stolen from them. This is Captain David to all ships. 13 years ago, we were sentenced to death by cowards who feared what we might become. They exiled us to a region of space that had consumed every previous expedition, expecting us to disappear quietly into the void. He paused, letting the words travel across the substrate network connecting the fleet. 300 ships and nearly 2 million crew members focused entirely on what he was about to say. They were wrong about us. They were wrong about the dead zone. They were wrong about what happens when you corner a species that refuses to die quietly. Around him, he could feel the fleet's attention sharpening. We're going home today, not as refugees, not as petitioners, but as equals who will no longer tolerate being treated as something disposable. The Federation will see us, and will understand that their attempt to eliminate us only made us stronger. And if they choose to respond with violence, David allowed himself a small, cold smile, feeling 13 years of preparation settle into perfect readiness. Then they will learn why you don't abandon humanity in places where the rules no longer apply. Fleet standing by for jump, Michael reported. David nodded. All ships, transition to normal space. Destination, Federation Council chambers. Let's show them what a mistake looks like. The jump was simultaneous. 300 ships dropping out of the dead zone and into normal space in perfect synchronization, their emergence generating gravitational waves detectable across half the sector. They materialized in orbit around the Federation Council world, their presence announced by every sensor array on every ship in the system. The response was immediate and entirely predictable. Alarms, emergency broadcasts, defense fleets scrambling to intercept. Within minutes, David's communication systems were saturated with demands to identify themselves, explain their presence, surrender immediately to Federation authority. Open a channel to the council chambers, David ordered. All frequency maximum broadcast power. Channel open, Robert confirmed. This is Captain David of the Terran Fleet, addressing the Galactic Federation Council. 13 years ago, you sentenced humanity to exile in the dead zone, expecting us to die quietly out of your sight. We have returned to inform you that the sentence was inadequate. On the main screen, the image shifted to the council chambers. Ambassador Threen sat in his assigned seat, six-fingered hands locked around the armrests, as he stared at the transmission with an expression that blended disbelief with dawning horror. This is impossible, Threen said. Nothing survives the dead zone. We're not nothing, David replied. And we didn't merely survive. We thrived. We adapted. We evolved. We became something your cowardly little council never imagined we could be. A Around the chambers, other council members were stirring, some demanding security, others calling for explanations. But Threen's gaze remained fixed on David's face, recognition spreading alongside a terrible understanding of what he was actually seeing. "You're different," Threen said slowly. "What happened to you in there?" "We learned," David said simply. "We learned how to hear the silence between the stars. We learned to work with forces your science insists don't exist. We learned what we become when you stop trying to control us." The exile was legally justified. "The exile was murder by bureaucracy," David interrupted, "and we have the documentation to prove it. Every species deserves a trial before execution, Ambassador. That's in your own laws, which you so graciously provided us before shipping us off to die." He gestured, and Robert transmitted a data package into the council's systems. 13 years of legal research compiled by scholars who had devoted every waking hour to finding gaps in the Federation's justification for humanity's removal. "We're not here to beg for readmission to your Federation," David continued. "We're here to inform you that we exist, that we remember exactly what you did to us, and that we will not tolerate any further attempts to eliminate or constrain our species." "You cannot threaten the Federation Council," one of the other ambassadors sputtered. "We have laws." "You have laws that you apply selectively to species you don't fear," David replied. "But fear is a peculiar thing, Ambassador. It makes you careful. It makes you think twice before taking actions that carry consequences." On the tactical display, David could see the Federation Defense Fleet taking up position around his ships. Hundreds of vessels, armed with weapons designed to fracture planets. By any rational calculation, it should have given him pause. It should have prompted him to reconsider the wisdom of this confrontation. Instead, he felt only the cold clarity of knowing precisely what his fleet had become. "We're going to establish trade relations with any species that chooses to deal with us," David said. "We're going to settle worlds within our designated territory. We're going to operate as a sovereign entity with full rights and privileges under galactic law." "Absolutely not," Threen snapped. "Your exile was permanent. Our exile was illegal," David interrupted. "According to Preservation Statute 447B, Section 12, Paragraph 7, any species subjected to relocation retains the right to petition for review after demonstrating successful adaptation to their new environment. We're petitioning for review." The silence that followed was absolute. David watched as council members frantically consulted their legal databases, working to verify the statute he had cited. It was there, buried in a subsection that no one had read in centuries. A legal escape clause included to satisfy some long-dead bureaucrat's sense of procedural completeness. "The petition process takes years," Threen said finally. His voice stretched tight. "There are procedures, requirements, documentation that must be submitted." "We've had 13 years," David replied. "We've met every requirement." "Robert, transmit the petition package." The data that flooded the council's systems was comprehensive beyond anything they had been prepared to receive. Population records, economic analyses, technological assessments, environmental impact studies, legal briefs, diplomatic proposals, 13 years of painstaking documentation, compiled by people who had nothing to do but plan for exactly this moment. "This is extensive," one of the council members admitted, scrolling through the material with growing unease. "We were thorough," Robert said from his station. "We had the time to be thorough." David watched as the council members absorbed what humanity had built, saw the precise moment when they understood that not only had the exile failed, but that something extraordinary had taken its place. The population figures alone were staggering. 13 billion humans across 47 worlds, all flourishing in an environment that should have been unlivable. But it was the technological assessments generating the real alarm. Ships that shouldn't have been buildable. Weapons operating on principles that violated known physics. AI systems that had evolved beyond anything the Federation had ever produced. "This technology," another council member said slowly, "where did you acquire it?" "We built it," Commander Michael replied, his voice steady across the channel. "We learned to cooperate with the dead zone rather than fight it. Everything we have, we created ourselves. That's not possible. No species has ever successfully operated advanced technology in the dead zone. No species has ever been forced to spend 13 years there," David interrupted. "You don't adapt to an impossible environment when you have the option to leave. You adapt when staying alive is the only choice available." Ambassador Threen had gone completely still, his expression unreadable. as he processed the full weight of what he was facing. "You're saying that by exiling you to the dead zone, we inadvertently provided you access to technology that exceeds our own. We're saying you made us dangerous by trying to make us vanish," David confirmed. "Congratulations on the outcome." The irony hung in the air like smoke. The Federation had exiled humanity to neutralize a threat, and in doing so had forged something far more formidable than a thriving young species. They had created a civilization that had stepped beyond the ordinary constraints of physics itself. "The petition will be reviewed," Threen said at last, his voice carefully composed, "according to proper procedures and timeline. In the meantime, you will return to the dead zone and await the Council's decision." "No," David said simply. "I beg your pardon?" "We're not returning to the dead zone. We're establishing an embassy here on the Council world. We're opening trade negotiations with any species that's interested. We're resuming our place in galactic society, whether you approve it or not. You cannot simply—" "We can," David interrupted. "And we are. You can choose to recognize us legally, or you can choose to treat us as hostile entities. But either way, we're staying." The threat was unspoken but unmistakable. The Federation could accept humanity's return peacefully, or they could attempt to force the issue militarily. And given what humanity had become in the dead zone, the military option was looking increasingly inadvisable. "This requires discussion," Threen said finally. "The Council needs time to deliberate." "You have 6 hours," David replied. "After that, we begin making our own decisions about where to establish settlements and who to trade with." 6 hours is completely insufficient. 6 hours is generous. You had 13 years to consider the consequences of your actions. We're giving you 6 hours to accept reality. Don't waste them." He cut the transmission, leaving the Council chambers in uproar. "That went well," General Peter said dryly. "They're terrified," Commander Michael observed. "The defense fleet is repositioning but not engaging. They're trying to determine whether they can win a fight without knowing what we're capable of." "Can they?" David asked. Michael hesitated, then shook his head. "Not based on what I'm seeing. Their weapons are designed for conventional space combat. Ours are designed to ignore the rules entirely. If it comes battle, we'll go through them like they're nothing." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Robert said. "Because if we start a war with the Federation on their doorstep, every species in the galaxy will see us as the aggressors." "They already see us as something to be eliminated," David replied. "At least this way, they'll see us as something to be respected." The 6 hours crawled past with excruciating patience. The Terran fleet held position in orbit, making no threatening moves, but showing no intention of departing. The Federation defense fleet maintained their distance, weapons charged but not aimed. It was a standoff balanced on the edge of catastrophe, where a single miscalculation could shatter everything into violence. David spent the time reviewing reports from the zone-born crew members who were monitoring the substrate around the Council world, flagging unusual patterns. The dead zone's direct influence didn't reach this far into normal space, but the substrate existed everywhere, invisible to conventional instruments, readable only to those who had learned to perceive it. "There's something wrong with the local substrate," a young engineer reported. "It's been corrupted somehow. Like static in a radio signal, but intentional." "Explain," David ordered. "Someone's jamming it, sir, creating interference patterns that would prevent substrate-based communication or navigation. It's sophisticated work. Not Federation technology, but something designed specifically to counter our capabilities." David felt cold certainty settling over him. "How long has this been in place?" "At least several years, based on the pattern degradation. This isn't a response to our arrival. Someone's been preparing for this." He pulled up the tactical display, studying the positions of the Federation ships with new eyes. The arrangement had looked random at first, but viewed through the lens of substrate interference, a different picture emerged. "It's a trap," David said quietly. "The Council expected us to come back eventually. They've been preparing." "How is that possible?" Robert asked. "They thought we were dead." "They hoped we were dead," David corrected. "But hope isn't certainty. Someone on that council was smart enough to plan for the possibility that we might survive." General Peter was already running tactical simulations, his expression grimly focused. "If they activate that interference at full power, our substrate-based systems will be compromised. We'll be operating at maybe 60% effectiveness. Still enough to win? Probably. But it'll be costly, and will take real casualties." David stared at the display, weighing options that all carried different flavors of wrong. They could withdraw, retreat to the dead zone and give the Federation more preparation time. They could strike preemptively, eliminating the threat before it could be activated. Or they could hold for the 6 hours to expire and hope that wiser heads would prevail. There's another option, Commander Michael said quietly. We could disable their interference system before they activate it. The substrate patterns show where the generators are located. All automated platforms scattered throughout the system. A few Zoneborn with the right training could reach them through substrate space and shut them down without ever being detected. Substrate space? Robert asked. You mean leaving the ship without a ship? The Zoneborn can do it, Michael confirmed. We've been practicing in the dead zone, projecting consciousness through the substrate while leaving the body behind. It's difficult and dangerous, but it's achievable. David looked at him steadily. How dangerous? Some people don't come back, Michael admitted. Their consciousness gets lost in the substrate, or fragments, or simply dissolves. We've lost about 1 in 20 during training exercises. That's a 5% fatality rate. That's a 95% success rate in an environment we barely understand, Michael countered, and it's better odds than fighting a compromised battle. David closed his eyes, making peace with what he was about to authorize. They had come so far, survived so much, adapted to conditions that should have ended them. And now he was going to ask young people, most of them barely adults, to risk their consciousness on a mission that might leave them hollow. How many volunteers do you have? He asked finally. All of them, Michael replied. Every Zoneborn on the fleet volunteered the moment we understood what we were facing. Of course they did, David muttered. Get them ready. We move in 3 hours. The operation was launched with a precision that could only have existed in the dead zone. 50 Zoneborn scattered across the fleet simultaneously released their consciousness into the substrate and began navigating toward the interference generators. Ghost-like presences moving through dimensions. Conventional matter couldn't touch. David watched through instruments that could barely trace their progress. It took 27 minutes to reach all the generators. 8 more to understand how to disable them. 3 to execute the shutdowns. And 1 minute for David to understand that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Sir, we've lost contact with 17 of the Zoneborn, Michael reported, his voice controlled but barely. They're not responding to substrate signals, and their bodies are showing minimal brain activity. Can we retrieve them? We're trying. But the substrate around the generators was booby-trapped. Some kind of consciousness-disrupting field that activated when they interfered with the systems. We didn't detect it until it was too late. Something broke inside David, not his resolve, but the last remnant of hope that they could return to this galaxy without being forced to become the very monsters the Federation had feared. 17 young people who had volunteered to protect their fleet, now reduced to empty shells because he had sent them into danger without fully understanding what waited for them. Get medical teams to their bodies, he ordered. Do everything possible to retrieve their consciousness. And Michael, I want the names of everyone we lost. Yes, sir. The 6 hours expired with the interference system dismantled, and 17 Terran crew members in medical comas that might prove permanent. The Federation had prepared a trap. Humanity had taken it apart, and both sides now understood with total clarity exactly how high the stakes had climbed. Ambassador Threen's face appeared on the main screen, his expression a carefully managed compound of resignation and controlled fear. The Council has reviewed your petition, Threen said formally. We have decided to grant provisional recognition to humanity as a sovereign entity with limited rights within Federation space. Limited rights? David asked, his voice carrying a particular kind of quiet danger. You will be permitted to establish 1 embassy on the Council world. You will be permitted to engage in trade with species that voluntarily choose to deal with you. You will not be permitted to settle additional worlds beyond your dead zone territories without explicit Council approval. That's not recognition. That's probation. That is the best offer you're going to receive, Threen replied. Take it or leave it. David looked around the bridge, the faces of people who had survived 13 years of the impossible and walked out stronger. They had come here demanding equality, recognition, justice for what had been taken from them. And the Federation was offering conditional tolerance in return. We'll take it, David said finally. For now. For now, the galaxy is changing, Ambassador. Species are evolving, adapting, discovering new possibilities. You can try to manage that change, or you can try to comprehend it, but you cannot stop it. Is that a threat? It's an observation, David replied. We're not the first species to transcend normal limitations, and we won't be the last. The architects demonstrated that 2 billion years ago. We're simply the first to do it within your lifetime. He ended the transmission again, this time with a finality that felt like closing one chapter of a story, nowhere near its ending. So we won, Robert said after a moment. We survived, David corrected. Which is what we do, a pause. And the Zone-born we lost. David was quiet for a long time, thinking about 17 young volunteers who had offered themselves to protect their fleet and paid a price that might prove permanent. We remember them, he said finally. We honor them. And we make sure their sacrifice means something. The fleet remained in orbit for 3 more days, while humanity established their embassy on the Council world, and began the delicate process of reintegrating into galactic society. Trade negotiations opened with several species who had long been uncomfortable with humanity's exile. Diplomatic channels were created. Legal frameworks were drafted. But beneath the surface of civility, everyone involved understood that the relationship between humanity and the Federation had been altered at a fundamental level. They were no longer the eager young species desperate for acceptance. They were something older, stranger, and infinitely more difficult to dismiss. Do you think they'll ever trust us again? Robert asked during one of their evening conversations, held in person, because even the substrate couldn't fully replace the comfort of another human voice in the same room. I don't think they ever trusted us to begin with, David replied. That's why they exiled us. They were afraid of what we might become. And now we've become exactly what they feared. No, David said quietly. We've become what they made us. There's a difference. The weeks that followed were an uneasy mixture of diplomatic momentum and persistent undercurrent of tension. Species that had supported humanity's exile now approached cautiously with trade proposals. The Council initiated tentative discussions about expanding humanity's rights. Life slowly began trending towards something resembling normal, but David couldn't shake the feeling that something important was being missed. The substrate jamming system had been too sophisticated, too specifically engineered to counter abilities that no one should have known humanity possessed. Someone had been preparing for their return with a level of detail that implied insider knowledge. He was reviewing the technical specifications of the jamming system for the 100th time when Commander Michael entered his office carrying a data tablet with an expression that signaled nothing good. We finished analyzing the interference generators, Michael said without preamble. You need to see this. He set the tablet on the desk, displaying a schematic that made David's blood run cold. The technology was sophisticated, but not in the way Federation technology was sophisticated. It was elegant, organic, built to cooperate with the substrate rather than oppose it. It was designed like technology from the dead zone. This wasn't built by the Federation, David said slowly. No, sir. The design principles are too close to what we've developed ourselves. Whoever built this understands the substrate the same way we do. That's not possible. We're the only species to have spent significant time in the dead zone in the last 2 billion years. Unless we're not, Michael interrupted. Unless someone else has been living in there all this time, watching us, studying us, waiting for us to emerge. The implications landed like a wave. The architects had vanished 2 billion years ago, leaving only ruins and warnings. But what if they hadn't vanished at all? What if they had simply gone deeper into the dead zone, evolving beyond the need for physical form, becoming something that existed primarily within the substrate itself? What if humanity's adaptation to the dead zone hadn't been accidental, but guided? Get me everything we have on the architect ruins, David ordered. Every scan, every translation, every piece of data collected. And get General Peter. We need to discuss what else might be living in the dead zone. As Michael moved to gather the information, David turned back to the window, staring out at stars that had once seemed so welcoming, and now felt dense with undisclosed truths. They had survived their exile, returned to the galaxy as something new and formidable, forced the Federation to acknowledge them as equals. But somewhere in the dead zone, something ancient was watching. Something that had planted technology designed specifically to counter humanity's capabilities directly on the Federation's doorstep. Something that had known with perfect certainty that humans would eventually emerge from their supposed death sentence. and that something was waiting to see what humanity would do next. David thought about the 17 Zoneborn lying in medical comas, their consciousness scattered through the substrate. He thought about the architect's warning, about transcendence and extinction, and the choice that separated one from the other. He thought about the decision his species would ultimately have to make, whether to remain in the dead zone and risk becoming something no longer recognizable as human, or to stay in normal space and risk losing the very abilities that had kept them alive. He thought about the fact that something else had already faced that same choice 2 billion years ago, and had been living with the consequences ever since. And he understood with a certainty that felt like cold water in his chest that humanity's exile might not have been the Federation's decision alone, that something older, something that understood the dead zone in ways humans were only beginning to approach, might have arranged events to bring a new species into the substrate, a species young enough to adapt, seasoned enough to endure, and desperate enough to transcend, a species that could be shaped into something purposeful. His communication console chimed with an incoming message, not through conventional channels, not even through the substrate, but through something else entirely, something that traveled in the spaces between dimensions, carried on frequencies only Zoneborn could perceive. David activated the display, already certain of what he would find. The message was brief, composed in flawless human script. "Welcome home, children of Terra. We have been waiting for you. The real work is about to begin." It was signed with a symbol David recognized from the architect ruins, a glyph that translated, roughly, as "the ones who remember." David studied the message for a long time, feeling 13 years of struggle and adaptation settle into an entirely new context. They hadn't survived their exile through human determination alone. They hadn't adapted to the dead zone through random evolutionary chance. They had been cultivated, and somewhere in the depths of space where physics bent itself into unfamiliar shapes, something ancient was very satisfied with how the experiment had progressed. "Sir," General Peter's voice came from the doorway. "Michael said you needed to see me urgently." David turned to face him, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in the general's weathered expression. "Tell me, Peter, when we were preparing to leave the dead zone, did you ever wonder why everything went so smoothly? Why our technology adapted at exactly the rate we needed it to? Why the Zoneborn developed their abilities on precisely the schedule that served us best?" Peter frowned slowly. "I assumed we were just adapting efficiently, or being helped to adapt," David said quietly, "by something that wanted us to become exactly what we are." He showed Peter the message, watching as the full weight of its implications settled over the general like a shroud. "You think the architects are still alive?" Peter said at last. "I think something is still alive in the dead zone," David replied. "Something that's existed there far longer than 2 billion years. Something that knew we were coming and made preparations. And the Federation's decision to exile us, it might not have been entirely their decision at all." They stood together in silence, staring at a message that answered nothing and opened everything. Beyond the window, the stars of the Federation glittered with their ancient, indifferent light. Below, on the council world, politicians and diplomats were carefully negotiating the terms of humanity's red mission. And far away, in the depths of the dead zone where physics folded and consciousness merged with the substrate, something timeless and patient was waiting to see whether humanity would grasp what they had truly become. The exile was finished. The confrontation with the Federation had been resolved. But the real test, David understood this with the clarity of someone who had survived too much to deceive himself, was only just beginning. And this time, the challenge wasn't a chamber full of frightened bureaucrats or a fleet of conventional warships. It was whatever had been cultivating humanity in the darkness, shaping them toward purposes that were 2 billion years in the making. The galaxy had attempted to destroy them and failed. Now they would have to learn whether something far older than the galaxy itself had been trying to create them all along, and whether humanity could endure the answer to that question.